enclosed car park. Remain at the evacuation point until instructed that it is safe to re-enter the building. And the toilets are at the end of this corridor, turn right, and they're on the right-hand side. Many thanks.
A reminder that I am tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist me in that regard. I have read and will take into account the hearing statements that have been prepared, so there's no need for these to be substantially repeated. In order to test the plan for soundness and legal compliance, I will need to ask questions. You will see that I've already been doing this in preliminary questions and correspondence with the council, in the published MIQ documents and in earlier hearing sessions. And both the council and other participants have responded to these. The questions will continue today. However, anything that is asked should not be taken as demonstrating a particular predisposition on my part. It is open to the council to propose further changes to the plan, and I would ask that they keep a record of possible changes that arise during the discussions, and any changes that would constitute main modifications would be subject to future consultation. As ever, there will be a short session at the end of each sitting day to ensure that any suggested modifications or additional items, such as topic papers or other evidence that I might request suggested during the course of discussions, have been adequately recorded. So if we could move on now to the substantive matters for discussion. So this is matter 13, and this relates to the design, amenity and heritage aspects of the plan. So again, similar to some other topics that we've discussed earlier in the programme, this is one where I'm content to take what I've received largely as read, but I've got some further questions and clarifications on a number of specific points. So firstly, in terms of the plan's approach to heritage assets, could you take me through the main modifications proposed to the policies that deal with those aspects, please? And if you could highlight how they have responded, particularly to Historic England's comments on these matters, please.
Thank you, sir. We have suggested 10 main modifications as part of the MIQs. These are all related to consistency with the NPPF and greater clarity. MM61 and 65 is a suggestion in order to provide greater consistency with the NPPF and related to your question about substantial harm to the significance of heritage assets. We have determined that the easiest way to do this would be to provide the paragraph 201 of the framework in full. We have therefore also done this in some of the other policies, which includes MM70 and MM71. However, MM70 and MM71 also provide a distinction between designated and non-designated heritage assets, which relates to one of the questions Historic England had in relation to how they are dealt with differently in the MPPF. Then we have MM64 and MM66, which relate to your specific question in regards to the wording of in terms of illumination. We agree that this wasn't completely clear, so we have changed it to be clearer in the explanatory notes, which is MM66, and also provide be consistent with the MPPF in terms of talking about when it's supported rather than not permitted. We've also MM62 relates to a slight question about between original and original features. I agree that this is not quite the right best wording. So we propose with MM62 to change it to architectural features rather than original. I believe this is the best way to say that, as internally features need to be fixed and therefore they're most likely to be considered an architectural feature, to be considered part of the listing and significance. And then we have MM68, which relates to and MM67, which relates to your questions regarding enabling development policy. We hadn't originally included reference to the Historic England's guidance as it was out of date when we first wrote the policy. However, it has been updated and we have reviewed it. So we've suggested to put it in the other documents or guidance part of the text. And we've also added a reference to other legal agreements in regards to performance bonds. I believe there's one more that I've missed. That's MM63, which relates to your question about building control. We agree this isn't, this comes outside of the realms of the planning system, and so we have removed reference to the application of building regulations. Thanks.
Thank you. Just turning to MM62. I wonder whether architectural, the use of, I hear what you're saying in terms of the use of the term architectural features, but I wonder whether it's broad enough. And then sort of reviewing that proposed main mod. I wonder if something along the lines of a phrase such as this: contain internal features which contribute to their special interest, because the special interest is what the Act refers to, isn't it? Have you got any views on that, Ms. Piper?
Yes, I'm happy with that suggestion.
So in terms of policy DM20, so thank you for the response in the hearing statement to the questions I posed, particularly about criterion C of that policy. So I understand where you're coming from there and how that fits in with the statutory scheme. So this is the criterion that relates to the demolition of objects or structures within the curtilage of listed buildings. So I just have a couple of the possibly relatively trivial points, but I think they might assist with the clarity of the policy. So the first is grammatically, in the first sentence, should it be is rather than are, because it refers to the demolition. So the demolition of objects or structures within the curtilage of a listed building is supported by robust evidence. Second point is where it talks about the object or structure is incapable of repair for beneficial use or enjoyment, or is not of special architectural and historic interest. And just views on whether and or is not of special architectural or historic interest might make the policy more effective in terms of, you know, that it could be both. Views on that, Mr. Beglin?
So logically, that must be right. To take that away and make that change. Thank you.
Final point, and this is just a general question, possibly for Mr. Beglin here, because I know in terms of my enforcement colleagues, they get quite aerated, I think is the word, about the use of the word ancillary. So in terms of that term in that criterion, have you got any views on that?
Well, so whilst there is often debate about the use of the word ancillary, it is in the planning lexicon, as it were, a relatively well understood term. It's one of the main ways of describing the functional link between, in this case, the structure and its impact to the listed building. Speaking for myself, I can't think of an obvious improvement that would immediately assist in relation to C, but perhaps something in the explanatory text if there's a concern about the way that word might be interpreted. But Sarah, I suspect it's one of those that whilst in development management, it may be problematic from time to time. That may not be enough to tip the plan policy over the edge into unsoundness.
So in short, that'd be understood in your view, Mr. Beglin, at the development management stage.
So I think it would be. I mean, you know, it's not unusual, as it were, for there to be a level of debate about what ancillary might mean, and then whether or not what's under discussion actually falls within the umbrella of the meaning of that word. But in terms of, as I say, the planning lexicon, it is a word that's got some pedigree behind it now.
Just another minor point on main modification 64. So that's just to check that the main modification, that the grammar accords with the sentence there. So internally illuminated signs will not be supported if it's visually intrusive or compromise the character of the area. So should it be they are rather than if they are, yeah. In terms of non-designated heritage assets, so the plan refers to these being capable of being identified through the planning application process. So the status of an asset as a non-designated heritage one might not be known at the start of the application process. Just an open question there, does that provide sufficient certainty in terms of the development management process? And if not, is the approach justified? So this links back to my question about the distinction between the archaeological non-designated heritage assets, and there might be a legitimate reason why at the start of the development management process that is unknown, but it might be in an archaeological priority area, say where some investigations have to be done as part of the application. So that you know, the actual application there would flush out whether there are any non-designated heritage assets in those terms. I mean, is it the same for, to put it simply, sort of above ground structures and features in those terms? Just general views on that, please.
Yes, sir. It is roughly the same, is that just with listed buildings, non-designated structures, we don't have an exhaustive list. We haven't surveyed fully the area, so they can be found at any point, just like with a listed building, something can be identified at any time. And just as a building can be listed during the course of an application, often these places are hidden and we haven't seen them. Sometimes they are in plain view. We always try to identify it as early as possible, particularly if there's a pre-application, we will. We do try to identify them through our own local list and conservation area appraisals, but it's not always possible.
And is this perhaps a function of it being a rural authority? So we've heard the statistics on that earlier in the hearings, and that there's some quite large areas and sort of land holdings that might have structures or features that possibly aren't known until some kind of development management process starts taking place.
Yes, that's part of the reason. A lot of our local list, as I said, is not exhaustive at all. And some of the areas have not been surveyed remotely. And where they have, it's concentrated in the main areas of the town. We are trying in the future, as we work on the list, to make sure we cover the whole area when we look at parish by parish, but obviously we're not remotely near that point, and as before, you still can miss things, so it's still important to be able to identify it during the course of the plan application.
Okay, thank you. That's useful further background in terms of where you're coming from on that particular matter. Okay, yeah. So that's everything on the heritage assets. So thank you for that, Ms. Piper. So in terms of the other main modifications that have been proposed, there's main modification 49, 50 and 52. So could you talk me through those, please, and any soundness points that they are intended to address?
I think, sir, if we could pass over to Sarah Wells on Zoom to take you through those ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't think I can turn my camera off. It's been disabled this end.
Yes, we can hear you, Ms. Wells.
Let me just do, apologies. There we go. And you can see me now?
Yes.
Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Sarah. I'm from Waverley. I'm a planning projects team leader. Thank you, sir, for asking me to go through the main modifications with regard to the design aspects of the local plan part 2. Main modification number 49 is in relation, is with regard to your question about design codes. And as a council, Waverley are incredibly committed to the production of design codes. We don't believe it's appropriate to have that a strategic policy within local plan part 2, and it would be better placed for local plan part 1, but felt it necessary to add a modification to incorporate a reference to design codes, and main modification 49 sets out to do that, and we would seek to put that after paragraph 2.25 in local plan part 2. So just moving on, main modification number 50 is related to policy DM4 and the question about what is meant by significant schemes. I think that was a really helpful comment, and thank you very much for that. We felt that it was good to put an explanatory note after policy DM4 to explain what we would be looking at. And we haven't done that before, so I think that would help applicants to know quite at an early stage when design review would be required. We've set out through experience what we would see those elements to be, but it's not an exhaustive list, and would be considered on a case-by-case basis. Specifically, we've identified isolated homes in the countryside that are being justified under paragraph 80E of the MPPF, because that has a significant about the outstanding or innovative, and we feel that design review can aid that conversation. There are other points there about significant schemes, those that include master plans or design codes, new community developments that are accessible by the public, and schemes that are of specific design interest. We wouldn't normally ask for householder schemes or applications to go through a design review, but there are occasions that has happened because of the scale, because of the nature of Waverley, and some of the larger properties that we have. We sometimes do encourage applicants to go through design review to support the process, but hopefully that will give much greater clarity to applicants and the public about when we would look at design review taking place. But it would be on a case-by-case basis, and we would encourage it to take place at the earliest opportunity, and preferably at pre-application stage. Main modification, there's further modification number 52, and that talks about when we would be seeking master plans, and we've made a change to that, reflecting the rural nature of Waverley. Previously, we had suggested that master plans would normally be sought for developments with a combined total of 100 homes or more, but actually, thank you for the question. That made us have a bit more thought about that, and given the rural nature of Waverley and some of our much smaller villages and hamlets, we felt that we need to be a bit more specific, and specify 100 dwellings for the larger settlements of Cranley, Farnham, Godalming and Haslemere, and 50 dwellings for those outside those named settlements where the impact could be greater with a smaller scheme. That's main modification number 52. And I think that covers the design modifications. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. That's a useful summary of those main modifications and the reasons for them. So I just had one more question. This refers to policy DM3. So this is the waste water, the water infrastructure policy, isn't it? And the requirement for conditions relating to that. So those of you who were here last Thursday, I think, it might have been Tuesday, so things are starting to blur into one. Mr. Banner reminded us, he drew our attention to paragraph 188 of the framework, which talks about the focus of planning policies and decisions should be on whether proposed development is an acceptable use of land rather than the control of processes or emissions, where these are subject to separate pollution control regimes. So that, I mean, it refers specifically to those pollution control regimes. Mr. Banner was drawing in a wider point, wasn't he, in the discussion we had about connections to wastewater in terms of the Royal School side. But
So-
in terms of the applicability to policy DM3, any views on that?
So of course, that's right. Mr. Banner was concerned, I think, to reassure you that in cases where further infrastructure was needed dealing with the issues of water supply, that those duties imposed on the statutory undertaker would ensure that was not an issue, other than perhaps in relation to timing when it came to delivery. But so of course, it's always an issue of judgment where you have the interface between the planning scheme and what it can properly look to achieve, and some of the more detailed statutory codes that deal with the obligations of the statutory undertaker. DM3 is at that juxtaposition, as it were, and it's dealing with the situation where proposed development results in the need for upgrades and the ability of the local planning authority to think about and indeed apply suitable phasing conditions to ensure that proposals come forward in a way that's consistent and efficient. And so in those circumstances, it will potentially deal with issues that go slightly beyond what the statutory undertaker might otherwise consider in the strict discharge of its statutory duties. And so it does serve a planning function. We would say that for those purposes, it remains a useful and applicable policy. We invite you to keep it in, we say it's sound.
Thank you. So that concludes my questions on this topic. So thank you for your contributions this morning. If we could just have a brief housekeeping session about this afternoon's session. So I take it that there's we've got a bit longer in the room than was originally anticipated.
So yes, that's right, happily. There are now no, as it were, physical constraints on the use of the room, subject to, as it were, your patience and an opportunity to ensure that everyone is properly heard. So matter for your reflection, sir, but it may be that provides us with the opportunity to deal with the outstanding matters adequately this afternoon, which would certainly, as I endeavoured to express yesterday, would be the council's preference if it can be accommodated.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Beglan. I mean, for reasons I touched on briefly yesterday, and I'll return to in my closing remarks, I intend to keep an open mind on whether the reserve sessions might be useful, but I'd communicate that as swiftly as possible in any post-hearings correspondence. In terms of the timing, I'd hope we could cover off matter 6 by 5, hopefully at the latest. But then there's obviously the closing session. Now, my remarks on that, I think, would last. My element of that would last for about 20 minutes. But I just wondered, in terms of your closing comments, have you got a view on how long that might take?
So yes, it's no function of our closing to provide any kind of survey of the material that we've covered over the last few days, unless that would be of any significant assistance to you. So it's really going to be a very short address of about 5 minutes or so, a matter of formality rather than trying to revisit too much of the substance.
Yeah, and my closings will be procedural remarks. So so that hopefully with a fair win, that sounds doable with the time we've got this afternoon. So thank you for assisting with that, with the room and the availability of that. Okay, so if we adjourn now and we'll resume at 2 o'clock with the resumed matter 6 discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.